Welcome back to another episode of the Mindful Hunter Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jay Nichol. And today we are going to talk archery. I have refound my love of archery. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, and I'll just be totally transparent about this. You know, as the channel and the kind of platform of Mindful Hunter started growing, I mean, you can't help but recognize that the more kills you get, the more engagement you get. Like, nothing on Instagram gets even remotely close to as much engagement as a picture of a dead animal. For a guy, anyways. Girls, you have some different options at your disposal. And, you know, in hindsight, 3-4 years ago, I was doing almost exclusively bow hunts. And then as the channel started growing and as I was like, I'd like to be able to put up some more successful videos, I started going on more rifle hunts. And then before I realized it, I was doing more rifle hunts than bow hunts. And I kind of forgot what it was that I loved about hunting. And I want to take a minute and just talk about this like bow hunter versus rifle hunter thing, because I've heard a lot of dialogue, from various sources on this lately. And I think everybody's entitled to their own opinion. And at the end of the day, if what you're doing is legal and you enjoy it and it puts food on the plate, on the table for you and your family, I could not care less how you choose to hunt. And I will support everyone regardless of method of take. Hound hunters, rifle hunters, falconers, archers. I really don't care. I think it's great. I think the question needs to be, is that the form of hunting that gives you the most satisfaction? Then have at her, man. I support you 110%. Now, that being said, for me, I find the experience of bow hunting significantly different than the experience of rifle hunting. I've killed a pile of animals with rifles, and I've killed a pile of animals with a bow. And for me, the experience in general was just more like fulsome with the bow. I had to get closer. I was there when the arrow was released. I watched the animal's reaction, and I feel more of a connection with the weapon of a bow and arrow than I do with a rifle. And I know that's not true for everyone. I have true gun nut buddies, and I say that with all the love in the world. Like, I know for a fact they feel about their rifles the way I feel about my bow. I'll give you an example. A guy who's turning into quite a good buddy was the one who convinced me to take my bow on my last hunt. And I'll be honest, I hadn't really pulled my bow out in a while. I didn't even have arrows built. It was really a last minute decision to take the bow on the elk hunt. And when I went in my garage and I started building the arrows, I got a little choked up. I didn't start crying or anything. But I had this like sentimental moment where I was like, what have I been doing? Like, I can't explain it, but the connection I feel with that weapon when I start building the arrows, when I put it in the press and tune it, when I shoot through paper to get my bullet hole, I got a chronograph now when I'm timing it. Like, it's like an intimate connection. I feel like that bow is an extension of myself. And so hunting with it just feels more rewarding than hunting with a rifle. But I want to be super clear here. I don't know why that is, and I don't know why that's that weapon that connected me like this. There's nothing inherently better about hunting with a bow than a rifle. Hound hunting isn't better than bow hunting, isn't better than rifle hunting. Guys who call in elk are no better than guys who spot and stalk elk. Like, there's no better in any of this. It's all just different. And at the end of the day, we're all hunters. And so I choose to prefer to bow hunt simply because it provides me a different experience for the most part than rifle hunting does. I don't think I'm better than anybody else. I think where some people get confused is that there is this tone sometimes of like archery elitism. My buddy Yonke kind of said it best when he was sharing the fact that he killed an elk with some buddies from the States. And the first question that they asked him was it a bow or a rifle? And immediately there's this connotation that like if you say rifle, it's somehow less of a kill than a bow. And that's not true. There are rifle killed elk that are 10 times as hard to kill as opposed to certain bow killed elk. You know what I mean? There's some like elk get killed by bows every year in pretty slam dunk, not too difficult situations. And elk get killed every year by rifles by guys who were bleeding out of their eye sockets because of how hard they worked for it. So there's way more that goes into the conversation. If you really did want to assign some type of objective difficulty ranking to your hunt so that it could be comparable, let's have a quick conversation on that, because this kind of ties into what I do for a living with business consulting. So a metric is only good when it's comparable, because knowing some kind of absolute result of something, if you can't compare it to other things, doesn't help you in a business setting, because you need to know that when you apply forces to this thing, how does it change in relation to other things? And then you can make strategic decisions about what result you want as compared to other similar figures. In hunting, you've heard Ranella talk about his brother's purity rating. And I think whether we like it or not, we all have our own purity rating. We have things in hunting that we respect internally more than others. I'm not saying that this drives us to some type of value judgment or inferior, superior classification between hunters, but there are things that we believe are a little more pure and a little more true and a little, better for us than other things. And every hunter has their own definition of what that is. You hear out west guys talk pretty derogatory about stand hunting sometimes. And you can hear stand hunters talk pretty derogatorily about Western hunters. Like, everybody's got their own little, and I think most of that is like in good fun. I think anybody who's hunted for a significant amount of time and has tried a variety of differences and has tried a variety of disciplines recognizes that they're all equally difficult. Like, some of those stand guys who work a piece of property for years and figure out where to put the food plots, and like, that shit is hard, man. And they've got 7 or 8 stands on one piece of property, and they're waking up in the morning and they're looking at the wind forecast, and that's, dictating what stand they're going to go sit in. Like, that is some high level shit. I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. I'm off to do a whitetail hunt in Alberta. It's a guided hunt, kind of half buddy, half guide. And listen, man, I'm just going to do what I'm told. Like, I wouldn't know how to make those decisions because I don't have that particular skill set. However, I think why people have found this frustrating is that you are opening yourself up to other people's value judgment of your hunt, right? So when somebody asks that question, bow or rifle, they may want to assign some type of value judgment to your hunt. Who cares? It's your hunt. I'll be honest with you guys. I try and go on mostly difficult hunts. Yes, I go on a slam dunk hunt every now and then, or just like a fun with the boys hunt. Absolutely. But for the most part, when I'm planning my year, I'm looking to have 3 or 4 once in a lifetime experiences where I am challenged to the limits of my potential. And I try and figure out different ways to do that every time. It could be weapon choice. It could be terrain choice. It could be length of time. It could be solo versus accompanied. It could be, a variety of elements. But I do those things for me. because I know what it feels like when I create the most difficult situation I can. Because this is all fabricated. Like, let's take a deep breath here. It's all kind of bullshit. Do you know what I mean? Like, you could just go to the store. Like these guys who are saying like we have to do this to put meat on the table. I personally don't know very many hunters where the cost outweighs the rewards. Like if it was really just about putting meat on the table, you would just go buy half a cow because it would be way cheaper than what most of us spend on hunting every year. So if you're going to try and tell me that that's all it's about, I'm going to call bullshit on most people because it's not about that. It's about something deeper, more personal, more primal, something about putting yourself to the test and seeing how you stand up. Do you measure up? And so I put myself through these situations because I know how difficult they are. And then when I'm successful or I'm not successful, I get that sense of satisfaction that I increased the stakes and I was still able to keep my shit together. Now, whether or not somebody else gets that, I don't really give a shit. That's not my job. My job is to care about how I feel about my own personal challenges and failures and successes. And I think maybe if people cared a little bit less about how other people viewed their hunting and focused a little bit more on how they felt about it, there might be a little bit less of this. I really think it's a miscommunication. I don't think most bow hunters give a shit. And I think if you really had the conversation with most of these guys, they don't think that bow hunting is inherently better than rifle hunting. I think there's a difficulty discrepancy. I think for most hunts, if you took the exact same hunt and said to somebody, is this an easier hunt to do with a rifle or a bow? People are going to say the rifle's easier. I mean, that's why they open up rifle seasons when they want to increase the amount of animals taken. And they introduce primitive weapons like bows and muzzle loaders when they want to decrease the amount of numbers taken. Because in the same unit, in the same conditions, people are less successful with primitive weapons than modern rifles. That's not a matter of opinion. That's fact. But that's not a value judgment on why you choose to hunt with the weapon of your choice. Anyways, this is kind of dragging on longer than I wanted it to because I'm not looking to like get into a big debate or like start some shit or anything. What I am, the entire purpose of Mindful Hunter, the reason it's called Mindful Hunter, is that I'm trying to take a more thoughtful approach to why we do what we do and let you guys in on my thought process as I make these decisions. Because if you've been a part of the channel for a while, you've watched me evolve. Like the way I think about hunting and the way I hunt and the weapons I use and the way I go about doing things is different now than it was 5 years ago because I continue to grow and evolve as a hunter. And I hope that 5 years from now, you're looking at a slightly different hunter yet again. So yeah, just to reiterate, I personally support all forms of hunting as long as they're legal and ethical. And I don't think any one style of hunting is better than the other. I think at the end of the day, the question you need to ask yourself is what type of hunt or what characteristics can this hunt have that are going to create the most rewarding experience for me? Now, that might not mean the most success. That might not mean the easiest, and it might not mean the most fun. But what's going to create the most rewarding experience? What's going to help me grow the most as a hunter and as an individual? So there you go. That's my rant on, archery versus rifle. I hope everybody's, stacking bodies this year regardless of their weapon of choice. Now, to get on to the topic at hand, we are going to go over my 2022 archery setup, which is a very late conversation to be having because I actually bought this bow and decided on this arrow setup back in March, I believe, March or April, when I drove down to the bow rack and did a podcast and sat down with Kellen and had him build my bow for me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go over the bow build, and then I am going to get into a Q&A. A bunch of people sent in some archery related questions. So starting at the top, We have my bow is a Hoyt RX7 Ultra. It's a 34-inch axle to axle bow. It's carbon. I had the Hoyt strings replaced with gas ghost camo strings. It has an Epsilon, a Hampsky Epsilon release. Sorry, a Hampsky Epsilon rest, drop away rest, which is limb driven. I have a Black Gold Pro Hunter HD sight, which is a 5-pin slider. And I'm going to get into my opinion on sights and some real world examples of why I choose the sight that I do. I have 8-inch, it's either 8-inch or 10-inch stabilizer out front. I can't even remember what it's called. I'll look at it in my bow case or something and maybe post it on Instagram. It's a straight bar that comes out front. It's like the simplest thing in the world. It's carbon. It's got a couple of weights on the end. Now, the other interesting thing about the Hoyt RX7 is that it has a lower stabilizer as well. It's just this nubby little, 3-inch guy that kind of sticks out right at the joint of where the riser meets the limbs. And the philosophy being the lower down the weight, the more it impacts the bow. This is kind of like almost the same concept as front of center. But, and I have no side stabilization on this bow. So my old bow, which I just sold actually, shout out Danny, hope you enjoy the new Pro Defiant. I had to put side stabilization on it. Now, I think there's two reasons. I think the RX7 is inherently a better platform than the Pro Defiant 34. But I also think both Matthews and Hoyt have moved to these on-riser sight attachment systems. Matthews kind of creates a hole in the riser and you slide your sight through it and then attach it. Hoyt has attached a Picatinny rail right to the front of the riser and you mount your sight directly on that riser. So before, your sight was off to the side of the bow, and the sight's pretty heavy compared to like the actual total weight of the bow, and then putting it out to the side, it would always want to cant over to the side that the rest was on, and you would either have to put some weight or physically kind of readjust your grip to compensate for that lean. And so I had a side back bar on my old bow, made the bow, it was definitely heavier. But I liked a heavy bow. I find it dampens the shakes a little bit in the moment, and it's just overall a steadier, quieter shooting bow. But that's not necessary. The one thing that I love about this bow, I always had to compensate for lean on my old Pro Defiant. Like I'd have to check my bubble 2 or 3 times, and this one I pull back. I could close my eyes, man. I pull back and I open my eyes and I look at the bubble, and I'm level every time. Like this bow just sits true. I can't really explain it, but it was one of the things that when I went down there, I shot a Hoyt, a Matthews, a Prime. I shot a couple other ones and I can't remember what they were. But the reason I ended up going with the Hoyt, I had thought I was going to go with the Matthews, the VXR, because that was like, the big bow right now, and everybody loved it and it had all the hype and it's a great looking bow. But the thing about the Hoyt was that it just shot right for me. And I can't explain that to you. This is another interesting thing about bows. Like there's so many anchor points where the bow comes into contact with your body that if any of these are off, it's really uncomfortable and you kind of got to wiggle around and move your face a little bit and pull back a little farther and relax the front arm a little bit and angle your wrist a little more. And then, now it's sitting and everything feels flush and all my anchor points are true. With the Hoyt, every time I pulled it back, I just sank into my shooting position and it just felt right. And that's the only way I can explain it. And we're going to have a talk a little bit later about string angle and axle to axle. And I think that was why the Hoyt was a better fit for me than any of the other bows. I'm 6'1". I have a 29 or 30 inch draw, depending on the bow and the release that I'm using. And that's pretty tall and long for bow hunters. Like I'm in the upper part for sure. And yeah, it just fit really well. So I'm trying to think of what else is on that bow. I think that's about it. We talked sight, we talked rest, we talked stabilizer. Oh, and it's got a Hoyt quiver. Hoyt has come out with a new quiver, yet again, trying to keep everything as close to the bow as possible. I used to be a tight spot quiver guy. Still have no issues with tight spot quivers, love them. But this new Hoyt quiver is really impressive. The only issue I've had with it is that, how do I explain this without a visual aid? So on a quiver, you slide the tip of the arrow into like this foam, and then usually 2 or 3 inches above that, there'll be a little attachment mechanism, like this little hollow rubberized thing that you pop the arrow into. And then at some distance further up the arrow, maybe 6 inches, maybe 12 inches, maybe 18 inches, there'll be a second kind of rung of those. So the arrow is kind of held in 3 places: the tip, the front of the shaft, and the back of the shaft. And that stabilizes, and then the arrow doesn't go anywhere. The Hoyt quiver is quite short. So all 3 attachment mechanisms happen in, let's say, the first 8 inches, which means you have like 20 inches of arrow hanging out unattached. And I did notice that because there's greater leverage, if I caught the knock of an arrow on my pants as I was stepping up high over something, or if it got caught on a twig as I was going through some thick brush, it would pop my arrow out of the quiver. Not completely, and normally just out of the first kind of layer of attachment mechanisms, not the second one and not the tip, but it certainly could have. And when you're walking around with half a dozen broadheads, I mean, that's not something you want to happen. So that was just one kind of element of the Hoyt quiver that I'm not a big fan of. But how close it keeps the arrows to the bow is really impressive. Okay, so that's the bow setup. Now, what's my arrow setup? I'm using a Black Eagle Rampage 300 spine, cut to 30 inch, a boning carbon fluorescent yellow wrap with AAE hybrid 26 4-fletched veins with a pretty strong helical in fire gold, if anybody cares. I use iron will components up front. I have a 25 grain insert and a 10 grain collar for 35 grains in components. And then I run a 125 grain broadhead. So all up, the entire arrow with broadhead, components, fletched, knock, wrap, weighs 477 grains. And I just ordered some new components from Iron Will, and I actually went with 25 grain collars and 15 grain inserts because they were out of the 10 grain collars. And so it'll be a 5 grain heavier arrow. And like, people worry about small details a lot, and I think they should be worried about. They matter, but I'm telling you right now, my archery skill is not high enough that 5 grains different in my arrow weight is going to impact things at all. But I did want to start moving to the heavier collar because the 10 grain collars are significantly shorter. And the whole idea of a collar is to prevent angular force from splitting apart the carbon arrow at the tip. And I do feel like the longer that collar is, the greater the area that is protected from that angular force. I want you to think about shooting an arrow into a steel plate at 90 degrees. So you're looking at the steel plate dead on and you shoot it straight up. In that situation, you don't even really need a collar. Like, your arrow might blow up because it's a steel plate. But now I want you to think about shooting that steel plate at 45 degrees. So the steel plate is perfectly positioned at 45 degrees and you shoot right at it. When your arrow impacts that, the angular force that is applied to the tip of the arrow, the way carbon is manufactured, it's like parallel fibers running the length of the arrow. It's not particularly well suited to that type of impact, and the front of arrows tends to blow apart. So that's the whole argument for a collar system. And I'm shooting, the bow is at 70 pounds, and so it's shooting my 477 grain arrow at 277 feet per second. I think I might have got those numbers confused. I think my arrow actually weighs 483 grains, and I'm shooting 277 feet per second. Either way, A couple of grains one way or the other, like I said, doesn't matter. For all intents and purposes, I'm shooting a 480 grain arrow, 280 feet per second, which is exactly where I want to be for a couple of reasons. Let's talk about general arrow setup, because somebody's going to ask, like, what's your FOC? I don't know what my FOC is, and I don't care what my FOC is. If I had to guess, because of math I've run on previous similar arrow builds, I would say it's in the neighborhood of 12%, which if you asked me where I wanted it, that's where I'd tell you it is. I don't believe in extreme FOC. I've shot extreme FOC setups. I had difficulty tuning them. I don't believe in the physics of extreme FOC. There's a lot of like analogies, like it's like a baseball on the end of the string. And it's like, for anybody who's ever taken physics at the university level, like these analogies don't hold up. These are like bro science ways of explaining things that go against the very laws of physics. For the most part, extreme FOC is, popularized because of this kind of like weird stuff that Dr. Ashby put out, that like there's merit to some of it, but there's no merit to a lot of it. And so I believe in an arrow setup that is equally weighted is what most people would consider a slightly heavier setup. I don't want crazy heavy. I don't want crazy light. And I want to be shooting somewhere between 280 and 290 feet per second with that heavier arrow. Now, the reason for that heavier arrow is to create greater momentum, which gives you greater penetration. Also, heavier arrows shoot quieter. And some people would say one of the most important things is how much noise your bow makes, because if an animal jumps the string, it's not really going to matter where you aimed or how well your bow is tuned. I mean, some of those whitetails can move 12, 14 inches. Like it doesn't matter. So I like a heavier shooting setup that I would say is like moderately fast, or even just average fast. Like I'm not looking to shoot 320 or some crazy number like that. So that's the general setup. I'm trying to think of anything else I didn't cover. I use a hinge for a release. If anybody's curious, I practice with a hinge. I hunt with a hinge. Almost every animal I've killed with a bow has been killed with a hinge. It works perfect for me in hunting situations. I'm a big proponent of Joel Turner's shot sequence philosophies. I've been lucky enough to do some one-on-one work with Joel, and psychologically, the hinge is just the perfect trigger mechanism for me, because it's like once you level that pin and you see that spot, it just tends to go off for me exactly when I want it to go off. I get a nice surprise release. I get good shots. The vast majority of my shots land well. Obviously, the first shot on the elk didn't land too well, but that certainly wasn't related to the release of the arrow. That arrow went where I was aiming it. If there's any other questions about why I built the setup the way I did, or anything related to that, hit me up and let me know. For now, let's get into some questions. Okay. Kate asks, if I want to try a heavier broadhead, am I likely going to have to change my spine? The answer depends on how much heavier. Arrows are built incredibly well these days. If you want to know, technically, I'm marginally underspined. I should have a 250 spine arrow on my bow, because the spine chart for my draw length and my poundage maxes out at 300 spine with 100 grain broadhead on the end. And I'm running 160 grains up front. So I'm a little overweighted for a 300 spine, but I've tuned it, I've shot it. The bow shoots perfectly well. So whether you're technically over or underspined, or what it is good to know, but more importantly, practically, how does the bow shoot? Like, are you getting tears in your bullet holes? Are you having group tuning issues? Like, is the spine affecting the way you shoot? as a general rule, it's safer to be overspined than underspined. That doesn't mean you can just chuck a 250 spine arrow on a 40-pound bow. You can go too far that way as well. But if you're going to be marginally over or under, it's safer to be a little over. Now, in the particular arrow I'm using, if I have moved to a 250 spine arrow, it would have added 2 grains per inch to the length of the arrow. And it's a 30-inch arrow, so it would have added 60 grains to my whole setup. So it would have taken my setup and changed it automatically from a 480 grain arrow to a 540 grain arrow. Now, one could then say, well, go with a lighter broadhead and lighter components. However, at that point, and I told you I don't care about FOC, but I do like to be above that 10%. And at that point, I don't even know what you probably drop into like 7 or 8% FOC. And I think having a little bit more than that is better. I do like a moderate amount of FOC. I like to hit that 12% if I was going to aim for any number. And so when I looked at a 250 spine arrow, I'm like, it's too heavy. So I'm like, I'll buy some 300s, I'll shoot them and I'll see how they go. I've had very good success with the Black Eagle Rampage. I think they're a very well-built, strong arrow, and I think you get a little bit more out of their spine. I think they're a little under-reported, not in a negative way. I think they're just being kind of conservative, if you know what I mean. But yeah, if you're right at the end of what your spine is capable of, and you add another 50 or 100 grains to the point, you are likely going to start to get weak spine issues. However, one way to figure it out is just to try. And you can buy some pretty cheap, heavy field points and just put them on there and see how your bow reacts. Shoot it through paper, see how it tears. Next individual says something about how to get started for those of us who have never shot a bow. I'm going to provide you some counterintuitive advice. Jump in with both feet. I had never shot a compound bow in my life until I bought my first setup, and I dropped $3,500. And I bought a fully outfitted Pro Defiant 34, and that's the bow I just sold. And I shot it for 5 years. I believe in the commitment device of money. I believe that when you spend a shitload of money on something, you are more likely to maintain the behavior. And so when I get home with that $3,500 bow, I'm looking at it and I'm like, holy shit, you better start practicing with this thing or you just wasted a ton of money. Whereas if you walk into Canadian Tire or some other hack place and buy some piece of shit bow just to see if this is for me, are you really seeing if it's for you? Because have you created the situation which is most likely to create success? I would argue no, because the bow is crap and you're not going to really feel connected to it and you're not going to really care about it. Like, ask yourself, do I really want to try being a bow hunter? And if the answer is yes, then save up some money and do it right. And here's the deal. High-end bows retain value. You will most likely get 80% of your money back if you have to go sell that thing next year. So, especially in BC, because there's not that many used high-quality bows kicking around. I would highly recommend going to a high-end bow shop. Now, here's the bad news. We don't actually have any in British Columbia. I have yet to find and I'm probably going to get stoned for this, and I don't care. I have yet to find a bow shop that understands how to treat hunters, okay? Hunters are not target archers. We need different things from our bows, and I've been to both the shops in Vancouver. Now, there are exceptions. I know that people love Nathan. I don't know Nathan personally. I know he's not at Borman's full-time anymore. I think he might be an exception to the rule. He's a guy who gets it. He probably could set you up a very good bow, but he's not even there full-time anymore. I don't know of anybody else at any of the other bow shops that is actually setting up hunter setups. I could tell you horror stories about the guy who built my bow didn't even weigh the draw. Like, literally, I went and bought 80-pound limbs. He set them up for me. I got home and my bow was pulling 72 pounds. And I phoned him and I'm like, what's going on, man? This thing was supposed to be set up to 80. And he's like, oh, I'm not strong enough to pull that back. So I couldn't figure it out. And I was like, what? I'm like, you have a draw table. You don't need to pull it back by hand. And it was just like, that's insane to me. Like how it's irresponsible. Like you sold me 80-pound limbs and then put them on a bow and had them draw 72 pounds. My bow was never paper tuned because this guy doesn't shoot with broadheads. He's a target archer. Why would he care about paper tuning a bow? Any idiot can get a field point to fly straight. You really got to know what you're doing to tune a bow to get your broadheads and your field points to hit the same location 60 yards out. Like that's skill. So I'm going to tell you to go to a high-end bow shop. The bad news is I don't know of any in British Columbia. That's why I drove all the way down to the bow rack. I think Podium Archery in Spokane, the one that MFJJ owns, that Dan, aka Elk Shape, is talking about all the time, that's a lot closer to home. And like that dude is a ninja. He definitely knows what he's talking about. And if you're serious about this shit, I would go on a road trip, man. You know, chuck your wife and kid in the car and we're going to go to Spokane for the weekend. Go down, get it set up, because it takes hours. That's the other thing that none of these other bow shops ever did. Like I just showed up, they took the bow, they set it up, they handed it to me and I left. And I thought that's what was supposed to happen. You go to a place like a bow rack, I was in there for half a day. You know, I told him what I was looking for. He set up 5 bows for me. I walked in the morning with my coffee. He's like, there's the range and a bunch of arrows, man. Let me know when you want to talk more. And I literally just went and shot for an hour. Every single bow, back and forth, again and again. And then I asked him a bunch of questions. And then we tweaked a couple of them. I shot some more. And then I finally decided on my bow. And then we decided on components. And then he built an arrow. We started paper tuning. He's like, oh, I don't really like that. Spent some more time with it. Then he got my sight dialed in. I shot it to make sure the sight dialed in. Like it was like a 3 or 4 hour process. Now he wasn't dedicated to me for that 3 or 4 hour process. He would like jump in, do some stuff, and then go help other people. But like that's how intricate going to a shop and getting a bow set up should be. Now I'm lucky. I've bought a press, an arrow saw, a bow vise. I literally have an archery shop in my garage right now, so I can do all that stuff for myself. And I recommend long-term, that's where you should be headed, because the more in control of your gear that you feel, the more success you're going to have. But in the meantime, when you go to buy a new bow, yeah, hopefully you've got a buddy who knows what he's doing, who has a bow press, or you're willing to invest the time and energy to go to a good bow shop, because I think it is a completely different experience. The amount of frustration I had with my Pro Defiant, it took me 3 years to get that Pro Defiant shooting the way it should shoot. And what it took for me to do that, I got it tuned at both shops in town multiple times. None of it worked. They never could get, broadheads and field points to hit the same way. What it took was me buying a bow press and like super nerding out until I understood every inch of that bow and then tuning it. So yeah, man, if you want to get into bow hunting, I would ask yourself, is this something I really want to get into? And then look at some other hobbies. I'll be honest with you. So I was a DJ and a producer for like 10 years. Used to play at all the clubs in Vancouver and festivals and all that kind of shit. I don't even know if I've ever talked about that on here. Released a bunch of tracks on record labels, whole 9 yards. Anyways, when I decided I wanted my bow, I still had my turntables, like Tech 12s, legit, like badass ones. I had all my turntables, I had all my gear, I had all my vinyl, and it had been sitting in this room for probably 5 years without being touched. And I said to my wife, listen, I'm going to go sell all my DJ gear and I'm going to go buy a bow, because I believe in being a serial hobbyist. You know what I mean? Like I like hobbies, but I'm so obsessive. I can only have 1 or 2 of them at the same time. Right now, my life is hunting and bodybuilding. Other than my family and my business, that's the only 2 things that exist in my world, is hunting and bodybuilding. And as long as I keep it to 2 things, I can keep the expenses under control. But, so I went and sold all my DJ gear, and I think I got like $4 or $5 grand for it. And I went and bought a kick-ass setup. So ask yourself, if I really want this, if I really want to do this, is there something in my life that I can sacrifice to create the opportunity? Because it's going to take time, it's going to take money. And I do think if you commit to it fully like that, you're going to have a better experience. Up next, just to get started building arrows, bare bones, what do you need? The only thing you really need is an arrow fletching jig, because all archery online shops will send you arrows cut to length. Now, the issue is if you really want to nerd out, and here's the other thing, back to spine, the length you cut your arrow impacts the spine. The longer an arrow is, the weaker the spine. The shorter an arrow is, the tighter the spine, the stronger the spine. So one of the ways you can tune an arrow is by knocking off like a 1/4 inch at a time and strengthening that spine. It will change the tune of the arrow. You can't get into that type of stuff at home without an arrow saw. But for the most part, for most guys, like if you're asking what bare bones it takes to build an arrow, you're probably not at the point where you would be able to tell the difference in a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch length off your arrow in actual practical shooting ability anyways. So like Lancaster Archery or Black Ovis, they will cut your arrows to length for like 25 cents an arrow or something. It's dirt cheap. So once you have a cut arrow, the only thing you really need is a fletching jig. The Arizona Easy Fletch is a really nice one. It's not customizable at all. The helical is locked in, the placement is locked in, but it's super easy to use. And then the Bitzenberger jig is another one. Now, I do recommend there's this little additional component you can buy for it that some of the components are a little bit janky on it because it's like it's cast aluminum or something. So there's like every one is like a millimeter different. It's not like a perfectly machined device. And you can get these third-party components that increase the precision of the device. And I do recommend it's like another $20. So getting a Bitzenberger is nice. Now with the Bitzenberger, based on the handle that you buy, you're going to be locked into a certain direction of helical. You can buy a left helical, a right helical, or straight. Now when you fletch, that was the other thing. So I use a right helical, a pretty aggressive helical on my fletchings in my arrow build. And let's talk about that for a moment before we go back to like what fletching jig to buy. So the more vein you have at the back of your arrow, the greater the recovery will be after the arrow leaves the bow, and the more forgiving your arrow setup will be to broadheads, okay? So let's say you put no veins on the back of your arrow, bare shaft, and you shoot it. It'll go pretty straight with the field point out to a certain distance. But if you put a broadhead on that, it's going to start doing wonky shit because the plane of the broadhead is going to catch the air and there's nothing at the back of the arrow to compensate for that. So it's going to start dipping and weaving. Now, let's say you put 2 veins on the back with 0 degree offset and 0 helical. So it's just 2 straight veins. That will give you a mild amount of compensation. So as the arrow comes out of the bow, it will correct a little bit for the broadhead up front. And now let's say you go all the way to 4 fletch with extreme helical, you're going to have a lot of forgiveness. Now the drawback is you're also going to have a lot of surface area to catch wind. So the greater drag you create at the back of your arrow, the greater compensation you will have and the more forgiving setup you will have for broadheads. However, the more susceptible you will be to wind drag. So if you are in a strong wind situation, your arrow is going to be more likely pulled to the side. I would say I opt for like a moderately aggressive setup. It's got strong helical on it with like a mild offset. I don't even know what would be like 1 or 2 degrees. Because I like that forgiveness, and I don't tend to do a lot of long bomb shots in high wind. And I would say that's one of the things where the greater your skill is, the less vein you can get away with. But if you want like the dummy proof setup and you're just getting into archery, just use 4 fletch. Here's the other reason why I like 4 fletch, and it's kind of a dumb reason, but it's also kind of a brilliant reason. When you shoot an arrow that has 3 veins on it, you have to have the cock vein facing up, or the veins will come into contact with your bus and cable strings as you release the arrow. And so you need to physically look at that arrow, spin it, and place it on the string in the right direction. You can screw that up in the heat of a moment. A 4-fletch arrow that's done completely perpendicular, you can set them up so it kind of looks like an X-wing fighter, but no one really does that. You set them up so it's a perfect X. You can't put a 4-fletch arrow on a string incorrectly. It's impossible. You either do it up or down. It doesn't matter. And because it's parallel, your vanes are always equally distant from your cable and your bus strings. So that's really the main reason why I like 4-fletch, because it's simpler and it eradicates the opportunity for error, for human error. I can't put an arrow on the string wrong. It's physically impossible. Now I have the the Last Chance Archery fletching jig. Listen, it's way overkill for most people. The thing was like $300-400, but it is like the Jedi of fletching jigs. I can change offset. I can change helical. I can change direction. I can change placement on the arrow. Like, it is the most configurable fletching jig in existence. So if you're looking to like experiment and put different fletchings on in different directions and see which one your arrow works better with, I would recommend the Last Chance Archery, but it costs a shitload of money and you probably don't need it. What I do recommend is either the Arizona Easy Fletch or the Bitzenberger jig. They both work great. If you go to many pro shops, like you go to the Bow Rack, they're using the Bitzenberger jig. John Dudley always uses the Bitzenberger jig. Like, that's industry standard as far as fletching. And I would buy the right helical attachment if you're going to pick one, because it's the safest. It's going to fly the best. So, and the reason you want a right helical, by the way, is because helical introduces spin to your arrow as it leaves the bow. And a right helical is counter direction to the threads on your field tip or your broadhead. So if you have a left helical, as it goes into the target or the animal, it's going to want to unscrew the tip because it's going to be spinning in the same direction as those threads. When you put in a right helical, as it hits that target, it's actually spinning against those threads. So if anything, it would just make it even tighter. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but like if you're going to pick one direction or the other, because some people will even say like bows have a natural direction, and what you should do is bare shaft tune your bow, put a little silver Sharpie on it, and then whatever direction your arrow wants to spin is the direction that you should put helical on your arrows. And I suppose you could do it that way. I've always used right helical. I've never had a problem. Back to the question at hand. The only thing you need is a fletching jig. You're going to get some glue, 2 types of glue. Usually you're going to have a vane glue and you're going to have an insert glue. Some people use epoxy for inserts. I don't like it. I like AAE Max Bond for vanes and AAE Max Impact for inserts. And then buy yourself some vanes, buy yourself some wraps and components and broadheads and field points, and you're off to the races, and you can put together your own arrows. I prefer the hybrid vanes from AAE. So there's the hybrid and the Max Stealth have the exact same vane profile, and I like a longer, lower. The way I shoot, the higher profile vanes tend to come into contact with my lips and my chin, and I don't like that. So I use a lower profile, longer vane. Still gives me the same amount of surface area. Now, the reason that I use hybrids is that with the Max Stealth, which are my favorite profile vane, you had to use a primer pen, and there was all these steps before you actually glued the arrow to the shaft. The hybrid are like pre-primed, so you don't do anything with them. You take them out of the attachment, put a couple daubs of glue on it, spread it back and forth, slap it on your arrow, Bob's your uncle. So they're just a much easier vane to use. All right, up next, we don't have any rut archery only season. That sucks. Which archery season do you like best? This is not really true, because there is a December archery only whitetail season, which I would argue some of that is still in the whitetail rut. And I would say that's the only truly like beneficial archery season. I think also some areas, the 1st to the 9th, I'm starting to believe the rut happens earlier in British Columbia than I thought it did. I also believe in this like kind of two ruts. I'm seeing a lot of evidence of that lately. Like my buddy just told me there was bulls bugling up north like crazy on the 16th of October. And so having archery early September may be a slight benefit in some areas as well. I don't have an archery season I like best. I prefer to shoot archery. So for the most part, if I want to shoot my bow, I'm just going to take it out. And if that means I have to fight with rifle hunters, then so be it. I'm going to hunt the way I want to hunt, regardless of what season it is, as long as it's legal, you know? But if you're going to ask me in general what archery season I like best, regardless of location, it's the rut. It's the elk rut, 100%, hands down. Preferred ATA, which stands for axle to axle size. In other words, what's more important, string angle or shorter bow for packing? I'm going to say string angle. Same reason I believe in stabilization, because some people would say, well, a lighter bow is easier to pack. You don't need a stabilizer. It's just making your bow heavier for packing. I don't tend to think of it like that. I build the ideal weapon and then I just get used to carrying that around. Now, if there's ways I can make that weapon lighter without sacrificing quality, like when I replaced my Vortex scope with a loophole and shaved 9 ounces off my gun, and for all intents and purposes, it still acted and behaved in the exact same way, I think that's fine. But string angle's got to trump everything, because that's going to dictate how well you're able to anchor with your bow. And that was, another reason. As a taller guy, I tend to really like a 34-inch axle to axle. That's what fits me. There's no way I'd be able to shoot like a 29 or something like that. Now, you will see guys like Elk Shape. He went back and forth between a 29 and a 33 VXR. And I think he shot the 33-inch VXR slightly better, but he liked the packability of the 29. Now, in that case, he's shooting at such a high level that he might be willing to sacrifice 10% of a bow's shootability if it's going to produce an adequate return on packability. I can support that argument, but in general, for like normal people, get the bow that fits you best and then just get used to packing that around. My opinion on sights. I like a multi-pin slider, and here's why. Many times in my bow hunting career, I have entered into a situation with one expectation of how far I was going to have to shoot in order to kill an animal. And then, based on how things unfolded, before I had time to change anything on my bow, that distance changed. Let's look at the elk that I just shot. My first shot was somewhere between 7 and 12 yards. My second shot, seconds later, was at 30 yards. So if I had a single pin sight, you can compensate for it. They've got these dual track sights with 2 pins now, and you can hold over and you can gap shoot and you can do. But as far as the human brain works, the best thing is for you to take the center of the scope in a rifle, or like the center of the crosshairs, or take the pin on a bow sight and place it exactly where you want to shoot. You don't want to hold over and guess. You don't want to gap shoot. And in order to do that, I think a multi-pin sight is best. Now, you could get away with 3. I like 5 because it's got me covered 20 to 60. So I can basically shoot anything between 0 and 70 yards and never have to touch anything on my bow. So whatever happens in the heat of the moment, he runs over there, he runs up here, boom, I compensate, I shoot. And Dan was talking on his podcast recently about how he tried a 2-pin this year, like the dual track, the dual vertical pins, and he's going back to a multi-pin for exactly this reason. And you've got Haynes, who shoots a single pin and he dials it in. He also does a lot of like spot and stock elk hunting, so it's normally more of a controlled situation when he's pulling back. And I mean, I'm not going to criticize Cam Haynes. The dude just killed way more giants than I likely ever will. But for me, It's a multi-pin slider. Multi-pin so that you can react to situations real time and have the pin you need for the distance the animal is at. And a slider because it's future-proofed. I've never actually dialed in my slider. I've practiced out to 60 meters, which is 67 yards. And that's the furthest I've ever practiced. I have a 60-meter pin, and I don't feel comfortable shooting animals further than that, and I don't practice further than that. Now, that being said, I would like to get to the point where I'm practicing out to 100. Here's the funny thing about practicing at extreme distances. When I first get to the range after a break and I shoot at 40, I'm like, wow, that's far. Target looks small. Everything looks far away. There's a lot of shake in my bow. Now, if I'm practicing a lot, let's say I'm practicing at 60 meters, which is almost 70 yards every day, when I go back and shoot that target at 40, it feels like it's right in front of my face. Like, it's so wild how easy shooting at 40 is after shooting at 70. And so I think the same thing holds true. I do believe you can have ethical kill shots in the 60, 70 yard range. And if I'm going to take those shots, I'd like to be practicing at the 90 and 100 yard range. So you're practicing to exceed what you hope your actual skill level is in the field at the time, because you're never going to get the same level of performance that you get when you're calm and relaxed and there's no wind and everything's fine at the range. And so being able to slide up that bottom floater pin gives you that ability. So yeah, multi-pin slider all day. It's all I've ever owned, and it's all I plan on owning. How have you found blood trails on the Iron Will? I shoot QAD Exodus personally, and I like a 3-blade. I don't think you're going to get any argument from me that a 3-blade broadhead produces a better blood trail than a 2-blade broadhead. Nope. And I've heard great things about the QAD Exodus. I know that's what Trail shoots. I think it's probably a fantastic broadhead. I like the Iron Will for a variety of reasons, but I will say I have had less than ideal blood trails. And it could be due to shot placement. It could be due to other things, but I think there's a general acknowledgement that the Iron Wills don't create the best blood trails in the world. But the idea is, if I can get a pass through and he piles up in 40 yards, who cares about a blood trail? And if you're only getting, the more surface area you have on your broadhead, the less penetration you're going to get. And so I'm not saying that's what would happen with the QAD Exodus, but there's got to be a balance there between how much the size of the hole you're creating and the amount of penetration that you want. And I think the general science comes down to prefer the amount of penetration. I will take a pass through with a shitty blood trail any day over a non-pass through with a good blood trail, because if it doesn't kill him, or if I've got to trail him for 200-300 yards and that gives him a chance to get away, all day I'm going to take the pass through where he piles up in 40. But that doesn't always happen. So I think it's one thing to consider. You got to prioritize something. It's all a matter of compromise. Nick asked helical versus non-helical. It's wind drag, man. And so you're going to get better recovery for your broadheads with helical. You're going to get less wind drag with non-helical. You got to decide which is more important. I prefer recovery from my broadhead because I shoot fixed blades. Glassing steady while holding bow in one hand. How do you do it when elk hunting? So this is there's a great answer to this. So I take my bow, I hold it by the handle, and I put the lower cam in my hip, right? While I'm standing, like how you would lean it against you out at an angle. And that puts your top cam almost exactly at eye height. I take my binos out and I rest them on the cam. And then I glass like that. And it's like having them on a tripod. It's fantastic. It works amazingly well. So that's how you glass steady while bow hunting. Besides time behind the bow, what other things help improve you as a bow hunter? I think I got into some of this earlier, and I think getting to know your weapon. I think at the end, the longer you do this, everybody should get to the point where they've got a bow press, they're building their own arrows, they're tuning their own bow. I firmly believe the deeper you understand your equipment and the more in control you feel over it, the better you're going to shoot. I also think addressing the psychological components of shooting. These are the same for rifle shooters as they are for archery shooters. I think there are psychological mechanisms that help and hinder us from executing perfect shots. And if you start to understand those things, it's not just physical, it's mental as well. Again, I said I'm a Joel Turner guy. There's other people that you can look at for guidance in that area, but I like Joel's stuff for a variety of reasons. Have you seen or tried Creative Outdoors Montana bow sling, alternatively a better sling? I have not, and for the most part, I don't use a bow sling. A lot of times when I'm hunting with my bow, I'm hunting under the assumption that shit could pop off at any second. Now, if I was hiking in, I'd probably just strap my bow to the back of my pack. But other than that, I want my bow out and ready to go. And if I've got a bow sling on it, that's like one more thing I got to mess with. You know, when I shot my elk here recently, if I'd had my bow sling on it, would it have gone down the same way? Would I have alerted him to my presence with the sound of getting the bow sling off? I don't know, maybe. But I'll take a look at that Creative Outdoors one and I'll see if it's worth giving it a try. Where do you land on fixed versus mechanical and why? I land heavily on the side of fixed. And the reason is more reliable. I think most people go to mechanical because they don't have a well-tuned bow. And a mechanical broadhead, most of them will shoot where your field points shoot, even when your bow is not perfectly tuned. That's why I started shooting mechanicals, because they were the only thing I could get to hit anywhere near my field points. I think once you get a well-tuned bow, there is some argument that for extreme long bombs, you're going to have less air resistance with a mechanical, and so there could be some benefits there. I do know some guys like Yates in the Backcountry on Instagram who actually packs around both, and then based on the situation he's facing, he decides which one to use. I prefer to simplify things, and I'm not shooting things at 80 or 100 yards. My iron wills fly true with my field tips all the way out to 60. 60 is all I care about in the real world. I'm not looking to shoot shit past that. And fixed are just more reliable. You know, I have punched through ribs. I have punched through shoulders. The amount of shit I've punched through with a heavy bow, a heavy-ish arrow, and a fixed blade broadhead is mind-blowing. And so that's what I shoot with because it's more reliable. How long of a bow is impractical for hunting? 33 inches still okay? Yeah, 100%, man. I'd say 34. I'd say these like 37-inch target bows that's a little bit ridiculous. Partly because I just don't think you're getting that much more of a benefit. I think a 34-inch ATA is very stable in hand. I think you're going to get great string angle. For hunting purposes, I don't see the need to go up further than that. And I've already answered this. So broadhead selection, FOC, helical, fletch, arrow weight, bow poundage, and draw length. I answered all of that stuff already in great detail. All right, that's it. We're going to wrap it up. Now, I would like to focus on archery. Oh, I had a whole other section I was going to do on practicing, and I'm going to get away from, we're already over an hour. So maybe that's what I'm going to do next time is I have a bunch of tips for practicing archery for hunters. I think most people are practicing archery like target archers, and you're not a target archer, you're a hunter. And there's only one arrow that matters, and it's the first arrow. And I think a lot of practicing techniques people are employing are aimed at creating greater consistency over a larger data set. Like I can go shoot 50 arrows and most of them landed where they were supposed to. And it's like, that's not what matters as a hunter. What matters is your first arrow. And you probably haven't pulled back a bow in 3 days because you've been bivvy hunting elk and you haven't had any targets to shoot at. And you can practice in ways that will improve that specific response. So let's save that for another day. I do want to start getting into deeper archery. If people want more stuff, like, do you want an arrow building tutorial? Do you want me to show you how I tune my bow? Any of that kind of stuff, hit me up and maybe I'll throw up some videos on YouTube. For the most part, I believe there's better guys for that because they know more than I do. However, I think sometimes there's benefit in having somebody who's not like a dyed-in-the-wool expert, because I notice things still as a beginner and I can help explain things that other beginners think are important. Whereas sometimes someone who's an expert forgets the questions that you had when you were a beginner. So as always, if you can engage in the platform in any way, like, comment, share, subscribe. There's still some t-shirts and hats, mindfulhunter.com/shop. Greatly appreciated. I want to remind everybody, the new project is launching in about 2 weeks. I think I'm going to be able to launch it when I get back from Alberta. Super excited for that, so stay tuned. And as always, thanks for tuning in.